I've never really like talked about Dwyane Wade very much. And like, I'm someone who is not necessarily the biggest Dwyane Wade fan in the world. Dwyane Wade has quite a few instances where you can look at and be like, wow, that was pretty dirty. Like he's got a good compilation of dirty plays throughout his career. But like, even as someone who is not the biggest Dwyane Wade fan, I feel like there's not a whole lot of an argument here. Like, Dwyane Wade, the playoff resume speaks for itself when you compare it to James Harden, who has consistently been, for the most part, with some exceptions, obviously, James Harden has, for the most part, come up short in the playoffs. And like, that's not a hot take. That's not a secret. Like, that can be backed up pretty easily. And Dwyane Wade, it's like, when you're talking about the playing field between those two, it kind of just feels like a no-brainer to me. It's like, yeah, Wade's better.
Yeah, it's hard
Are there things that James Harden does better? Yes, absolutely. But for everything that James Harden does better than Dwyane Wade, you can point at other things that Dwyane Wade does better than Harden.
What I often find annoying when these debates happen is, I mean, I'm incapable of not being annoyed by everybody. So I'll find people who are even on my side that I'm like, all right, guys, dial it back. That's not true. And there are things about Dwyane that are not amazing, like namely outside of that 2006 run, specifically even the NBA Finals. He hasn't done a ton of incredibly impressive stuff in the postseason, you know, exceeding what you would already expect of him. Whereas obviously the 2006 finals was ridiculous. And for that series, let me just say, I do not buy the narrative that it was a rigged series whatsoever. I actually went back and watched the games that are available on YouTube. It's not all of them. And unfortunately, there's no just big library you can go to. But most of the time, the team just couldn't stay in front of him. And the only option that they had was to foul him. So that's why he got to the free throw line so damn much. But, you know, throughout his peak, he shot a lot of mid-range jumpers, and he wasn't as good as them as you might have thought. He was around 40% or so. So that's not ideal. Really, slashing, playmaking, and defense. That's where Dwyane Wade absolutely excelled. And for slashing and playmaking, I think as a player, you could argue that James Harden was on a not same level as slasher, but like probably like, I don't know, 85% as good. And he's definitely a better playmaker. I don't think many people would argue with that. And of course, way better three-point shooter. And I imagine back when he did shoot mid-range numbers, I would take a wild guess and assume that he was more efficient at that as well. So he just knocks him out of the park as a shooter. But defense is what it ultimately comes down to. Just one player plays really good defense. I don't know. Has Dwyane Wade made an all-defensive team? I'm pretty sure he has, but yes. I think it was a couple, but I know he had to compete with Kobe getting one in the guard position every single freaking year.
Yeah. He still made three, though, despite that.
I knew it wasn't a lot, but like James Harden never even sniffed being an all-NBA level defender, even when he got towards like the end of the Houston years, where he was not the joke of a defender that he was in his earlier Houston years. We're still talking about a player that was an okay defensive player versus someone, if we're just talking peak for peak here, who was a very, 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 very good perimeter defender. I think brought as much to the table offensively as you could hope, and namely, didn't really choke in the playoffs. If I'm trying to be a little bit more of a nice to James Harden, I think it's more like James Harden is great in the playoffs 90% of the time, but he chooses for that 10% to always be the fucking elimination game. So that kind of makes that 10% feel more like 40%. You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's the thing. Like, anytime someone calls like James Harden a playoff choker, and then like one of his stands comes out, they'll say something like, well, actually he averaged, 30 points per game on blank percent true shooting. And it's like, yeah, but if you go game by game in that series, or like quarter by quarter, the times that he was coming up short was in second halves and in closeout games and fourth quarters. It's like, you can put up all the numbers in the world, but if you're not doing it when it actually, like, and this is such a like cliche platitude, like if you're not doing it when it matters, but it's like, Yeah, Dwyane Wade, for the most part, obviously there's a pretty big blemish, but for the most part, Dwyane Wade got it done when he needed to.
Mm-hmm. I also do want to say out there, just in terms of stuff that's been a little unfair on the Harden side of things, is it's worth mentioning that Shaq was very good for most of that 2006 postseason run. He just didn't score much in the actual finals, which I feel like some people have talked about. And even in the past, I kind of over-exaggerated how not good Shaq was in that finals. I think I said he was basically Tristan Thompson in that series. That's a little bit of a oversell, especially because he has significantly more gravity as a scorer. Like he still averaged, like, I think 22 points a game in the playoff run up until that final series. But either way, man, doing what he did his third year in the season, like he had no right being that good that early. And I think the issue with Dwyane Wade's career, I think a lot of people would bring up the MVP thing, the fact that James Harden obviously has an MVP and Dwyane Wade doesn't. Not only that, James competed for MVPs for multiple years, but it's just the stars never aligned for Dwyane. It's not that he wasn't an MVP caliber player. Ask anyone who knows basically anything about basketball who's the best player who didn't win an MVP. Most of them are going to say Dwyane Wade. That's not quite the consensus, but it's pretty close to it. Ironically, I think another player would be Chris Paul. But yeah, either way, okay.
No, we're not. I'm just being.
We can't be real here.
Fool. I'm acting a fool. I'm sorry. Let me dial it back a little bit. I'll put the brakes.
Let me run these numbers by you guys. I'm going to give you just their statistical output, no accolades. I want you to tell me who you think would be better. Not who's who, just legit who you think's better.
Pure numbers is going to be Harden.
One of these guys averages 22, 5-5, 48, 29, 77 splits. The other guy averages 25, 6-7. 44, 36, 86 splits. So less efficient from the field, but more efficient from three and from the free throw line, more assists, more points, more rebounds.
What?
See, but it's kind of like those stats are like, you know, they say one thing, but it's another example of like, hey, you got to pair the stats with the eye test, which like is becoming an annoying cliche at this point. But it's true. Like, especially like when you talk about, you know, James Harden got more rebounds. It's kind of like another situation. And James Harden is a good rebounder. I'm not saying he's not a good rebounder, but it's like the Russell Westbrook situation of it's better for your guard to get the rebound so that they can initiate transition offense. It's like, okay, yeah, that doesn't mean he was a better rebounding presence than Dwyane Wade. It's just schematically the team would rather Harden get the rebound than somebody else on the team.
Right. It's just like Steven Adams and Russell Westbrook. It's just like Ja Morant and Steven Adams. It's like these guys are boxing out for their guards, right? And you said Steven Adams wasn't.
And even then, I mean, how much do we
I did
really
not
value?
say that.
Sorry, I'm oversimplifying.
How much do we really value rebounding at the guard position anyways? Like, I'm not gonna
I think rebounding at the guard position is like in most cases incredibly overrated.
I'm not rebounding is not deciding the Dwyane Wade James Harden debate. It's not.
Unless it's offensive rebounding. Defensive rebounding for a guard, like most of the time I do not care about it.
What are their offensive rebounding numbers, Rudy?
That's what's going to ultimately decide this, is who's the better career offensive
I'd much rather compare 5-year peak statistics versus
that's true.
All time, but at the same time, James Harden's numbers are still going to come out on top because James was a more volume player. Dwyane Wade averaged,
and we're in a much more inflated era.
Yes, in a much higher paced era, a much better spaced era, obviously. Imagine Dwyane Wade slashing, but he has 3 shooters around him. Like, oh my God, what a difference that would have made. James Harden obviously had that in favor. That's why he's also a more efficient player. But the volume with Harden was there, and namely, he was more the type of player who was okay with that. Like, Dwyane Wade averaged 30 points per game once. He won the scoring title that year, and he routinely not at the time, but like post his career, would bitch about having to score that much. Like he was like, I fucking hate that I have to score 30 points a game for us to have a chance at winning. Meanwhile, James Harden's like, I'll happily average 36 even though we are winning one way or the other.
Yeah.
Harden is so interesting to me because, like, this is not I don't know if I want to open this can of worms.
Go for it.
It's a podcast.
Basically, like,
y'all don't want to
in like such a stat-driven era where on one hand and it's obviously because James Harden, like, he passes the eye test. He's an incredible player. But like in such a analytically driven era, so much of like the narrative around James Harden's efficiency is like people always cite James Harden's true shooting percentage. Like anytime they bring up his like regular season average, MVP averages, postseason averages, it's never like you never get the shooting splits. You always get the true shooting percentage. And it's like, why is that? It was because of the free throws, and that's like literally what true shooting percentage is designed to do. And so like whenever you're comparing a player like Dwyane Wade and James Harden, it's like the true shooting percentage is always going to look better. Even if say like James Harden had a postseason where, and I'm just spitballing here, I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but James Harden, say he averaged 44, 32 and 87, 88, 90 splits or something like that. And then Dwyane Wade averaged, 46, 29 and 80 splits or something like that. James Harden is even though the efficiency from the field or from overall like is better for Dwyane Wade there outside of free throws. It's like, well, James Harden had more free throws and he shot better from the free throw line. So he's going to look better efficiency wise anytime you cite the true shooting percentage. And I don't know, like that doesn't bother me, but it's just like, it's so like reductive to just use that as the primary like measure of efficiency, which is why I don't always just default to true shooting percentage anymore. Cause I'm like, there's so much more to it than that. I don't know
if I agree with that perspective, because I think ultimately true shooting percentage is a much better measurement of efficiency than field goal percentage.
I'm not talking about efficiency. When you're talking about who's better, like who's doing something better on the basketball court, if you say like James Harden is a better slasher because he had a higher true shoot or anything.
I get what you mean.
Like you could not make the case for a specific skill in the scoring department strictly using true shooting percentage.
Yeah, we're talking about the whole package.
If you wanted to talk about like their mid-range scoring, you would need to talk about their mid-range efficiency. You couldn't just be like, well, James Harden was a better mid-range shooter because he had a higher true shooting percent. It's like, well, that's not true.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure his percentages were just better, period. Like I haven't dived into the numbers before this, but in general, that would be my guess, which is he's a little bit more efficient on it. But also, this is an era where the efficiency is just higher across the board. Like the standards of efficiency in Dwyane Wade's time, like people didn't even really consider efficiency. I don't really think that much back in his time. People were like, we play in early in his career when he was at his best, we play in a defensive era and we unload the fucking clip. We don't care. Just get as many shots up as you can and pray for the best. And in today's era with spacing, with players being as conscious of their numbers as they have ever been because of the social media era, and that also being the difference between getting paid or not in a more analytical era as well. It's just, that's naturally how it's going to be. If you take a player from the 2000s and early 2010s and compare them to a player today, they're going to be less efficient. That's just the nature of this thing. I'm more interested in relative to the league average true shooting, and James was a little bit better than Dwyane in that department, contrasting them to their league average. But ultimately, I think it's a negligible difference, and it comes down to who do I want leading my franchise between those two players. And to me, it's not even a debate. I want the guy who's going to play defense, and I want the guy who I can rely on in a clutch moment, in a playoff moment, I rely on to carry my team to a freaking NBA championship rather than if James Harden went down 0-2 in the NBA finals like Dwyane Wade did in 2006, leading that team. That's a 4-game series, man. It's over and Dallas wins. Meanwhile, Dwyane decided to average 39 points per game for the last 4 games of that series. And to me, it's that and it's defense. Discussion over.
If we want to put defense aside, because a lot of people do, like, you know, there's a certain type of basketball enjoyer that just
they can do it all they want. It doesn't fucking matter. It's still a part of it. They can try to act like that doesn't matter.
Hypothetically,
if we're talking about math, but we leave out like, you know, algebra, let's just ignore that for a second. It's like, no,
catch that joke?
Makes no sense.
I'm sure the chat did. I was just saying, let's just say that both these guys kind of have the same role in the NBA through 2 different eras. Dwyane Wade was kind of always pushing for that best 2-guard spot in the league. James Harden has kind of always been doing that same thing until recently as well. Sure, they kind of fringe between James is a bit more of a point guard and Dwyane is kind of more of an undersized forward deep down. But regardless of that, they're both, you know, foul baiting all-time great guards who were not quite, slashers. Who were not quite the best during their era, but were very, very close. That being said, would you rather have 1 MVP or 3 championships and a finals MVP?
3 championships and a finals MVP. I don't give a damn about.
Right. And so it's still Dwyane Wade, even if you ignore the defense.
Well, also just 1 championship and finals MVP, specifically the 2006 one. Like, for me, the 2018 MVP is the one Harden has, right? That MVP doesn't make me think much different of James than I already did. I already knew he was an MVP tier player. This was just the year where the stars aligned and that finally happened. For Dwyane, he kind of peaked earlier on in his career, and in your first couple of years in the league, he had Shaq in the regular season putting up good numbers, so he wasn't really going to get MVP discussions. And then Shaq was gone, and the team just sucked ass. So he couldn't get them a good enough record, even when averaging 30 points per game, as previously mentioned, even though a lot of people argue he should have won MVP that year. I personally disagree pretty strongly on that. But either way, that did happen. And then LeBron came around, and he's not going to win a fucking MVP with LeBron on his team. So it's really just a matter of circumstances. They were both MVP caliber players at their absolute peak, 100%.
Also, the real issue here is that there's like 30 to maybe 40% of people talking about this actually watched Dwyane Wade play basketball, and the rest of them were literally either still in diapers or like not born yet when Dwyane Wade won his first championship. It's like, this is a very older group of basketball fans versus younger group of basketball fans debate. That's what it is. The younger generation is going to lean Harden in a lot of cases, and I think the majority still probably goes Dwyane Wade, but I don't know. That's, to me, where this debate really stems from.
I do think if Dwyane Wade were to be born in Harden's place or whatever, like have his timeline instead of his own, that he would be 1, a point guard, and 2, be like a Russell Westbrook level guy where he's just jumping out the gym, flirting with triple doubles all the time, and just kind of sucking at shooting, but being a hilariously amazing slasher, you know? So that being said,
I think Dwyane Wade is the best slashing guard of all time, personally. At his absolute peak, that is, you know.
And that midi just never missed, man. I love Dwyane Wade.
That's not true. I literally just opened this talking about how his mid-range percentages were not great.
I know, but you know, in my
in the highlights, he never misses.
Exactly.
Probably relative to league average, they were pretty good. Because like he had, I'm looking at Cleaning the Glass right now. We don't have to get into this, but like he had seasons where he would shoot like 30% or 40% from mid range, but that was 70th percentile. So that's like pretty good.
That's so bad.
It's like, for context to the listeners, like league average mid range efficiency now is like 42%. It's getting higher. It's only trending upwards.
Yeah, it's shocking how that happens when you stop taking a bunch of terrible ones.
The league is full of hoopers.
I guess that ends that non-debate debate where we all sat here and agreed with each other.